Hello and welcome along. So in this video we're continuing with the series on the early lives of the Primarchs, and today we're going to look at Konrad Curze, otherwise known as the Night Haunter. So Curze is of course notorious amongst the Primarchs for his true insanity, driven by his ability to see the future, his precognition, and particularly his ability to see a very dark future, to see the deaths of everyone he ever met, to see the terrible violence that would envelop the Imperium in the future, to see betrayal and murder and all of the worst parts of humanity wherever he looked. And this started to happen from the instant he crawled out of his gestation pod on Nostromo. So, of course, Curze landed on the world of Nostromo, which is an industrial hive world which had a very weak sun and so had very little light. So it was in near perpetual darkness. And the society that existed on Nostromo was one that had become deeply corrupt and was full of criminality. So at every level of the society, there was corruption and crime, from the very lowest street gangs who roamed the cities and literally killed people to eat them, all the way up to the aristocracy who ran the hive cities, who, well, I say ran them, didn't really run them at all, but just leached off of the manufacturing of adamantium, which was the planet's really major and almost singular industry. And of course, because everything was so corrupt, it was also very inefficient. So they weren't doing a particularly large trade in adamantium, but they were, whatever was made, they were taking pretty much all the value out of it as they sold it to neighboring systems. And there was a massive disparity between those at the top, those small number of aristocrats, crime bosses, and corrupt officials, etc., and everybody else who lived in abject poverty, so much so that they also indulged in terrible crime on a day-to-day basis just to survive. Literally, children killing other children to eat them so that they could live was normal on Nostromo. And an infant, Curze, emerges into this world, basically fighting his way up through the geology of the planet as he was deposited very deep into the planet. It's even believed in Nostromo mythology that he landed actually in the molten core of the planet. That probably isn't true because even a Primarch as an infant is unlikely to be able to survive swimming through molten lava. But he did seem to erupt up from the underhive, so he probably was deep inside the hive city, down in the bowels of the city, and had to make his way up very slowly, so slowly that the hole where he actually came into the hive was covered over and for a long time before he finally emerged. And so he probably spent many years just wandering the underhive, eventually making his way up further and further to eventually reach the surface. Because Nostromo's a world with such low light levels, there's not much difference between the underhive and the surface, to be honest. Now, unlike any of the other Primarchs, really, Curze never gained a family of any sort. Now, the other Primarchs had various different levels of good and bad in terms of those around them, who influenced them, who took them under their wing. But they all had someone who took them in and they became a part of a group. And so even someone like Angron had his fellow gladiators. Although he didn't have a true mother or father figure, he wasn't taken in by one of the great families of the planet or anything like that. He still had a sense of camaraderie from his other gladiators. Curze didn't even have that. He had nothing. All Curze's life was watching other people. He watched their behavior and he learned from the way that they behaved. And the way that they behaved was, as I just described, extremely badly. His norm for what behavior is was watching these street gangs murdering people, skinning them, eating them, watching families turn on each other just to survive, watching the very powerful exploit everybody else, seeing corruption at every turn. And that was his model for how to be, how to grow up, how to exist. And on top of all of that, he's got these visions that are constantly hitting him all the time, which he obviously has no understanding of, no reason to know why they would happen or what they mean, which are always of terrible future events, of war, murder, betrayal, etc. These terrible things all the time that are hitting him. So he was molded by this experience to the point where he became essentially a monster in the dark. He was surviving by eating first pests, like some form of probably giant rats and things like this. And as he became more and more capable, he started eating people. He was literally stalking people to eat them and survive. So he never became this beloved figure by anybody. So he never gained any positive role models at all. He was nothing more than this shadowy monster that existed in the dark that would take people, kill them, eat them, just surviving, just getting by, and watching from a distance what was going on. Until eventually he matured enough for the background effects of his genes, of what the Emperor had created him to be, this future potential Primarch, overcame that initial experience of growing up completely on his own as a feral child on Nostromo, on this terrible world where all he saw was death. And it started to tell him, in a way, speak to him, that he needed to be more than that, that he was something more than just this monster in the dark that was just surviving. And he began to feel this need to impose justice on the world around him. Now, of course, his idea of justice is very twisted by the fact that his ideas are formed by what he's seen. So he thinks, well, how do I impose justice on this world? I'll use the tactics I've seen the gangs use on other gangs and on those who don't bow down to them. The tactics that the corrupt police use, the corrupt leadership of the world, the aristocracy, all of the examples he's seen of how do you get people to do things you want. Well, you punish them very severely, extremely severely, until they do what you want or they die and other people do what you want because they've seen them die horribly. And so he starts doing that. And at first it's a small scale. He's just doing it to anyone he comes across, because pretty much universally anyone he comes across is a criminal and doing something wrong. And of course he has a very low bar for what counts as criminality. So almost anything you could imagine is a sin worth death in his eyes. So you don't have to be doing much to get him to see you and immediately kill you in the most horrible way he can. Now, eventually he becomes more focused, more strategic in the way that he's doing this, and he starts to work his way up the ladder. He's no longer just killing random people walking down the street who are doing something he thinks is slightly wrong. He's starting to target the leadership of the gangs. He's starting to target the corrupt officials and the aristocracy of this world that he's found himself in. And because of this, of course, he starts to be noticed by them. It's no longer random nobodies disappearing from the streets, because that was happening all the time anyway. No one would even blink an eyelid. It was starting to be important people disappearing and then reappearing as mutilated corpses, hung out in public to be seen. And he was making more and more of an impact. And so he started to gain this nickname, the Night Haunter, from the people. He adopted that nickname. He actually wanted it, and he played into the role of this creature in the dark that is stalking people and can see everything and is unstoppable. It will always get his prey. And he starts to hunt the people sent to hunt him. So as the more powerful people are noticing that he's targeting them, they're sending out groups of people to stop him, to kill him, to bring him back in, to capture him or whatever. It doesn't really matter. They just want this to stop. They don't want to be tortured to death, and they don't want people interfering with their power structure that they are doing quite well out of. But he is unstoppable as far as the people of Nostromo are concerned, because there's no one there that can match what he has as a Primarch. And now he's grown up. He's bigger, he's stronger, he's faster. There's nothing that anyone can do to threaten him, and he knows it. He revels in this idea that they're coming to get him, so that he can just, it's just easier for him. The people he wants to kill are coming for him, so he just kills them. And then he always allows people to survive, heavily mutilated, but to go back and spread the message that he's coming for these people. He's coming for these leaders, the most powerful, the most corrupt on the planet. And eventually he'll get to them. That's his message. So he's sowing fear all the time. He's sowing terror. He's using terror tactics to spread his reputation as this monster in the dark that can't be stopped, that is relentless, will always get his prey. Eventually, crime starts to reduce for a couple of reasons. One, the more criminal elements are dying off more rapidly than the less criminal elements, because almost everyone is some level of criminal on Nostromo, but he's become more and more aggressively targeting the more criminal, the more powerful. And so the balance is starting to switch in favor of the less criminal being more normal. But also the sheer terror of the fact that he could pop out of the dark at any moment and kill you is making people, even people who'd lived an entire life of criminality, of severe criminality, think twice before they do anything. So almost all crime is starting to stop. And so his tactics are working. And after a time, about a year of this campaign of terror to bring justice to Nostromo, it actually had worked. And essentially all crime had stopped. And so he went to the remaining aristocracy and revealed himself to them and essentially gave them the option: kneel to me, follow my leadership, or die. And it seems like most of them chose to agree because they didn't have much choice. Probably some of them resisted and were killed, but certainly the majority decided, okay, we can't stop this guy. He's obviously way too powerful. Let's just accept that he's now in charge. And that's what they did. And so he became Nostromo's first king, and he was known as the Dark King, the first and only king of Nostromo. And as king, he actually did quite a good job. So, yes, he had this tactic of using extreme punishments for even the most minor crime. He personally carried out these punishments. If ever he heard of any wrongdoing or the slightest thing, he would personally go and hunt that person down and beat them to death in the streets. He would then televise these events so that people could see this happening across the Nostromo and be kept under control by the fact that, well, they could be next. Anything they might do that was just the slightest bit wrong could lead to him turning up on their doorstep. And it worked. So people stopped all crime. There was essentially no crime on Nostromo for a couple of decades while he was king. Productivity went up massively. The quality of life rose. And although people were living in terror and they were working themselves near to death, they were working exceptionally hard. They were producing enormous amounts of adamantium, which the planet could then sell and made the planet productive. They weren't living happy lives, but they were living crime-free and productive lives. And this was essentially the state of the planet until the arrival of the Emperor. Now, this is quite interesting. So he did use these extreme tactics, these terror tactics, and these methods that were, pretty terrible, obviously. But the fact that once they did actually work to the point of actually maintaining order, the stopping crime, he didn't do other terrible things. He didn't try and kill or torture people for fun. He didn't try and dominate or exploit the population in any other way. He dominated them completely in terms of control. He wanted complete and total control so that there was no corruption or crime, but he didn't try it in any other way. He didn't try to exploit that to make himself super wealthy or live an incredibly extravagant lifestyle or to attain worship or adoration from the people. That was all irrelevant to him. All he wanted was perfect order, and he had attained that, so he didn't need to do anything else. And that was it. He just watched them in silence until the Emperor came. And he organized things extremely well. He made them much more prosperous. He made them extremely efficient, so much so that you could see the underlying skills that he had. Remember, he's got these skills from essentially nowhere. They're just emerging out of his mind, out of his gene seed, what was planted there by the Emperor. He's not learning it from really anyone else because there's not anyone there that's particularly good at anything that can teach him anything other than murder and cannibalism. But even the aristocracy, they obviously know some amount of leadership skills, some amount of industrial skills that had led them to have this adamantium industry and to sell that to other neighboring systems, but they weren't doing a particularly good job at it. And so he wasn't learning from particularly highly skilled people in these areas. So most of it just came from himself. He just saw, well, this isn't working. This is how you do it better. This isn't working. Okay, change it like this, do it better. With this very, very strongly motivated population, he achieved these enormous productivity increases, which led to the increased prosperity for the planet. So he was very skilled. Deep down, he had all the skills that you'd expect from a Primarch. In fact, perhaps more than most other Primarchs in these areas. That when he wasn't having these terrible visions of people's future deaths or other future terrible events of wars, etc., and he was in control of himself, he was actually a very good king, a very good leader. So I know that's obviously a big thing to put aside. When he's not brutally beating you to death, he's great. But the thing is, that is true. And he had this complete black and white personality of like everything's perfect until you step out of line the slightest way. It might even be that you don't even know that you've done something wrong, and he would still brutally kill you. So obviously, a terrible place to live under constant fear of death for the most minor infringement that you might not even know you've done. But at the same time, it was reaffirming for him that he must have done the right thing because it was so much better than what was there before, where it was chaotic and corrupt and everyone was living in terror still, but they were living in terror and not achieving anything. So now he had imposed his order upon them. They were living in terror of him, but they were productive and efficient, and the cities were clean and well lit, and things were moving forward. So in his mind, he's obviously done the right thing. It's all working, and great, let's just carry on like this. And at this point, this is where the Emperor enters the story. So, of course, Curze had foreseen the Emperor's arrival because he could see the future, and didn't attempt in any way to resist the Emperor. However, he wasn't happy to see the Emperor. He knew what the Emperor had in store for him. He knew the terrible things that his brothers would do in the future and that he would do, and he saw the terrible future of the Imperium. So for him, the arrival of the Emperor and the Imperium was not some incredible event that allowed him to reach his full potential as one of the Emperor's sons out in the stars. It was more just another inevitable step towards this terrible future that he'd seen. And so he kind of met it as a sort of inevitable event, not something to be cheered or something to be avoided because you couldn't avoid it. It was just going to happen, and that was just what life was like as far as he was concerned. Life was pain, and this was just a future pain that was going to come his way, and that was just the way it was. Now, some interesting things happened when he did meet the Emperor, in that he did meet 4 of his brothers at the same time, and he saw the deaths of Dawn and Ferrus Manus. He also met Lorgar, and he saw Lorgar's future psychic awakening. He didn't understand the context of that and how Lorgar would have turned to chaos. But he also saw Fulgrim, and he saw something about Fulgrim's transformation into becoming a demon prince. But again, he didn't really see the full context of that or what it really meant. He just couldn't quite see Fulgrim as he was. He saw him as a kind of slithering, difficult to see, always sort of moving object that was still Fulgrim yet not. And so he didn't really understand what he was seeing. But he also didn't see Fulgrim's death, and he felt quite a connection to Fulgrim because Fulgrim was actually genuinely nice to him when he met him, and he wasn't pretending to be nice like he felt the other brothers were, and he wasn't or just not being nice like some of the other brothers as well. He felt like Fulgrim was generally warm towards him, which he'd never really experienced. And he didn't see Fulgrim's death, which was also pleasant for him because he nearly always saw someone's death when he met them. And that was a great relief for him. So being around Fulgrim was quite pleasant for him. And luckily for him, the Emperor gave Fulgrim the task of bringing Curze into the Imperium and teaching him what it was to be a Primarch, to be a leader of a legion, etc. And during that time, he actually did quite well. He learned from Fulgrim. He was quite happy, seemingly, and Fulgrim seemed to have some kind of bond with him, and that was about the most human connection he'd ever had in his life, never would have in his life, because eventually he would be given command of the Night Lords Legion, which he named the Night Lords after himself as the Night Haunter, and he would go off as the leader of the Night Lords to do all the terrible things that they would do together. And he never really developed a great bond with the Night Lords themselves, never had any affection for any of them, and treated them pretty terribly, as you'd imagine. Of course, eventually his own homeworld would rebel against him, and he would notoriously wipe it out for that terrible act of betrayal that he saw as. And interestingly, of course, as soon as he left Nostromo, it very rapidly fell back into crime because he'd created this almost what he thought was a perfect society of perfect order and productivity, but it was just a veneer over the top. People were still the same people. They just pretended to be these good, productive people while he was watching. And as soon as he wasn't watching, they fell back into their old ways. Corruption re-emerged radically, and crime re-emerged, and the inequality re-emerged, and it just became the same terrible place it was before he arrived. So given all of this, what can we really say about Curze? How much of what Curze became is inevitable simply because of the way he was? How much of it is it down to having landed on a terrible world like Nostromo with such a terrible example? How much is it the fact that he never had that family, that surrogate family, something to belong to? How much of what he is nature and nurture, essentially, is what we're asking. And what potential did he have to be? What could he have been? Could he have been one of the greats? What could he have been a Sanguinius? Could he have directed his obvious very high level of natural skills to something positive within the Imperium? Or was he always supposed to be this terrible weapon of fear, just a tool for the Emperor? Now, I think a good way of looking at what a Primarch is supposed to be, based on what the Emperor wanted, is to look at their legion before they met their Primarch. And you can get a reasonably good idea of what effect the gene seed had on those recruits, and therefore what the essential genetic core of that Primarch is. And if we look at the Night Lords, they are very much like Konrad Curze. They always used terror tactics before they met him. They just used them more once he was in charge. They were always used as a weapon of terror by the Emperor, and they were created to be a weapon of terror. It's very clear that he created them to be that. However, they were much more controlled. They weren't as sadistic as they were after he took control. They were generally using those terror tactics in a much more considered way, in a much more directed, surgical way, to get the results that they needed. And so you could argue that that was how he was supposed to be. And had he not had both the terrible experience of growing up in Nostromo without anyone to guide him, and these terrible visions that drove him to insanity, he might well have grown up to be a much more rational, reasonable, logical version of himself, who was more like that Dark King who ruled for 20 years, but without the extreme punishments for the very minorest crime. Someone who just helped bring justice and efficiency and morality to the Imperium, to the wider Imperium, in the name of the Emperor. Perhaps he could have been destined for a role as the sort of head judge of the Imperium. Now, of course, imperial justice, even outside of what he thought was normal, was still pretty rough. The way that the enforcers across the Imperium delivered justice was pretty brutal, but they did it in extreme circumstances when they were dealing with very violent and criminal elements within the hives, cities that they were working in. And so you could argue that they were kind of forced into that. Had he been able to reach his full potential and become this more rational version of himself, could he have created a system of imperial justice that actually worked well and in the long term, and wasn't just a sticky plaster over the top of this actual seething resentment that was underneath, like he had on Nostromo? Maybe he could have. Maybe that was his future potential if he hadn't been turned into the monster that he did. Was it inevitable that he became that monster? Why did he become the monster? It doesn't seem to be just his upbringing on Nostromo. It seems like he did kind of overcome that himself, even without any outside influence. He kind of got past that mostly, and he just had this residual element of it where he wouldn't be able to see the difference between an actual severe crime and a minor misdemeanor. He didn't have that nuance, but he got past everything else. He was running a very well-ordered, efficient society. He wasn't falling into the traps of leadership and power that generally people tend to do. So it does seem like there was a lot of good in him, a lot of potential in him, and that he had achieved a large amount of it completely on his own. So had he had that little bit extra guidance, had he had a little bit more attention from the Emperor or from the other Primarchs, and not just been let loose after his short internship with Fulgrim, perhaps he could have become that person, that positive Primarch that had a good impact on the Imperium. And ultimately, it does seem like it's the visions that were the major issue. The fact that he saw always negative things in the future essentially left him have a kind of defeatist idea of what the future could be. He didn't really have any hope for the future. He didn't have any feeling of power over the future, that he could make it better and stop the inevitably terrible things he was seeing in his mind. So it was just kind of, well, these are going to happen. I just have to live with that. So what's the point in doing anything? Because it's all going to end in betrayal and pain and war and destruction. So could the Emperor have done more to stop those visions? And it seems like he could, because when he first met Curze had this terrible vision that he was getting of by seeing the Emperor, probably of the Emperor's death, or something else to do with what the Emperor was going to do in the future, or perhaps what he would do to Curze in the way that he would treat Curze and the other Primarchs. So terrible that he was trying to pull his own eyes out. And the Emperor simply touched his head and made it go away. Be at peace, I am the Buddha. Why couldn't he have done that in the long term? All he had to do was shield Curze from the worst of the terrible visions he was getting, and he would have been fine. But of course, the Emperor was too busy to do that, trying to fiddle with the webway. So, I don't know. Maybe it would have been too much for the Emperor to do that in the long term. It doesn't seem like it should be, considering how ridiculously powerful a psyker he is. Could Magnus not have taken him under his wing and just blocked out these terrible visions for him? Could he have been trained? Again, the Emperor or Malcador, Magnus, they could have got together and trained Curze to actually control these visions. Sanguinius could have helped, of course, because he's got the same visions, except that he has more positive views of the future, although that may just be down to the way he personally interprets the future rather than the way that Curze does, rather than Curze always getting terrible visions because that's just the way his brain works, and Sanguinius always getting positive views of the future because he doesn't actually always get positive visions of the future. And he tends not to let the bad ones get to him, whereas Curze would obsess over the bad ones and think that was all that was possible. He would never look past the vision and think, well, maybe this is just a possibility. Perhaps he wasn't cursed with just endless torturous visions. It's just that he grew up on a planet where terrible things happened all the time. So obviously everyone he met was going to have a vision of the terrible future death. And then he met people who happened to have futures that resulted in their deaths in some of the Primarchs. He was generally surrounded by people who were warriors fighting in wars who were probably going to die at some point in probably a terrible way. So it kind of reinforced his idea that all he could ever see was death and war and terrible things, terrible events for individuals. Perhaps if he'd been surrounded by people who are going to have quite nice lives, he might have had quite nice visions. But certainly he must have been potential for him to be trained to control the visions and to repress them, to hold them back, to filter them, and to interpret them. And that could have been delivered by, as I said, any of these very powerful psychers that existed within the Imperium who had similar experiences and were able to get by quite happily with these visions. But that didn't happen. That instead he was just used as his terror weapon by the Emperor. And so again, you have to think that really it's the Emperor's made a decision. Look, I could help him, but I'm just not gonna. He's got a part to play in my plan, and quite frankly, as long as he's out there killing the right people, I don't care. And that does seem to be what the Emperor did. Perhaps short-sightedness of the Emperor in letting Curze go off the rails, like he did with Angron, of course, and others, led to Curze being the Night Haunter, this terrible monster that had risen out of the pits of Nostromo, actually essentially self-corrected himself into becoming this reasonably good king, like the Dark King, to then revert to becoming the Night Haunter again through just not being able to control this terrible visions, not being able to see any positive future for the Imperium. So there you go. That's the Night Haunter, Konrad Curze. Was he always doomed to be the monster, or was it all the Emperor's fault? Let me know in the comments. Great to hear from you as usual. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time.